Greetings, Wanderer! Are you looking to get into Vagrant Story but heard it's kind of complicated and tough to understand? Maybe you already started and you ran face first into a nasty wyvern that you can only do 1 to 3 damage at a time to, and you just can't figure out why. Well, let me help you with that. Vagrant Story seems complicated at first, and the complete lack of tutorials really doesn't help. But in time, the mechanics will seem, at the very least, sensible, and a fine mastery of them can turn you into an overpowered warlord in almost any battle. So where do we start? Well, let's start where the battle does and discuss the interface. When you enter a room and there's an enemy around, you better assume battle has already begun. If you're responsible, you don't keep your weapon out at all times. So draw your weapon and get ready to go all in. When your weapon is drawn, the game will let you know that you have entered battle mode. The unseasoned player will likely go in for an attack before anything else. This isn't what I would call a smart move or even suggested, but we're gonna pause here and discuss all the things we see on the screen. In the top left corner, you have your HP. This is pretty self-explanatory. It may seem like you don't have much HP, but it's more than enough to get you through the game, and it won't raise too much over the course of your playthrough. Next to that is your MP. MP is also rather limited in supply, making the usefulness of expensive offensive magic rather limited. Your MP is best reserved for buffs, debuffs, enchantments, healing, and curatives. It's worth noting that both MP and HP slowly recover on their own, so when in between battles, take a moment to heal up using spells rather than items. When you decide to attack, you will notice a green spherical grid appear around your character. This grid is called the target sphere and indicates the range of your basic melee attack as dictated by your weapon's range stat. Anything within this grid is fair game to attack. When you target enemies, you will notice you can target individual parts of their body. Each body part has different weaknesses, and your chance of hitting and how much damage you deal varies from limb to limb. At the bottom of the screen, you can see 2 numbers. The first number indicates the estimated damage to be expected before RNG comes into play. The second indicates your chance of landing a hit. The information below that appears to outline the enemy's stats, but not quite. The first 2 pieces of information, in all caps, are your attack type and affinity. The third piece of information is the class of enemy. Not the most useful information on screen, but the reminder can come in handy from time to time. You may have also noticed an icon in the bottom left of the screen of your character's body, and how your individual limbs can be damaged just as the enemies can. Surely, having limbs be separately targetable isn't only there to play a game of choice between damage outputs and chance of hitting, right? Of course not. As each limb gets damaged, you and the enemies will face the consequences of the damage. Limbs in red are referred to as dying limbs, and the consequences are as follows. A dying right arm lowers attack power by 50%, effectively cutting all normal and break art attacks in half. A dying left arm lowers parry chance by 50%. A dying head inflicts silence, preventing you from using spells. A dying body increases risk by 200%. At 200% risk gradually accumulates while the target sphere is open. And dying legs decrease movement by 50%. Consider these effects while attacking the enemies. If an enemy moves too fast, try dealing heavy damage to their legs. If they cast too many spells, maybe target their head. And finally, beneath the HP and MP menus is the risk counter. Don't ignore the risk counter, as the crux of the battle balances delicately on this number. As you attack your enemies and chain attacks together, each attack you use adds to the total number in the risk pool. Different attacks add a different amount of risk, though some attacks such as break arts do not add to the risk at all. As risk increases, several things change. The higher the risk, the lower your chance of hitting your target is. The higher the risk, the higher your damage output and chance of critical attack is, if you land a hit. The higher the risk, the lower your defense. The higher the risk, the higher the enemy's damage output. The higher the risk, the more effective your intelligence stat becomes, making spells do more. In short, at high risk, all damage stats count for more, and all defense and accuracy stats count for less. Keep your risk as low as possible at all times. During battle, this is not easy to do without the use of items. Risk cools down automatically when you're not attacking, but of course not attacking in a battle situation is a sure way to inch closer to your demise. So the deal here is to battle efficiently. Use only attacks the enemy is weak to, and finish them off before the attacks drive your risk too high. When battle ends, idle in the room until your risk completely depletes. as any leftover risk will carry over into the next battle if you do not. While there is something to be said about trying to use high-risk situations to your advantage, simply put, the chances of landing attacks goes far too low for it to be comfortably viable to me. Furthermore, the enemy's damage output gets high enough that high-risk situations truly are high risk. Risk ranges from 0 to 100. In response to this, your chance of landing hits can also range from 0% to 100%. But even at 0% chance to hit, you can still hit. And at 100% chance to hit, you can still miss. So all is never truly lost if you find yourself in a 0% situation that you cannot get out of. Now, I did just mention chaining attacks together and how every attack adds a different amount of risk. So let's move on to the different types of attacks in Vagrant Story. Firstly, of course, you have your basic melee strike. This is all you start with. But in time, Ashley will recall long-forgotten battle techniques he can use as chain attacks. If you hold L2, you can bring up a shortcut menu. Pressing right on the D-pad here will bring you to a menu where you can set chain attacks. Chain attacks can be set to square, triangle, and circle. Only 3 can be set at a time, and only to those 3 buttons. Each attack works in its own way. Read the description and pick the ones that you think will work best for you in battle. I would suggest, however, keeping on some chain attacks that actually add additional damage in good quantity. When you have your chain attacks set, feel free to take them into battle. You start every chain with a basic melee attack. At the point of your weapon's impact, a red exclamation mark will appear over your head as a visual indicator for when to use your next attack. When this appears, hit square, triangle, or circle, and you will use the move you mapped to that button. If you miss the prompt, your chain will end. If you hit, the chain continues. Chains can be carried out indefinitely or until you miss or your enemy dies. Just note that each consecutive attack will drive risk higher. You cannot chain square to square though. Attacks must be chained to different moves or they will simply fail. You may also notice you're graded on your accuracy. Pay attention to these as they will let you know how to improve, though don't be thrown off if you think you're getting it right, but the prompt only says cool. It technically means the exact same thing as perfect. Most prompts only say one thing, whether it be too slow or too fast. However, good, excellent, right on, perfect, well-timed, nice, great, and cool all mean perfect. If your initial melee strike is a miss or had 0 damage, this too may throw off the rest of your combo. Many chain attacks are based on the damage output of your first hit, so a second attack that deals 40% of the first attack's damage is pretty useless if your first attack is 0 or 1. If we bring up that L2 shortcut menu again, you may see a menu for defense abilities. These are executed the same as chain attacks, but cannot be chained together. When the enemy attacks you, simply hit square, triangle, or circle at the moment of impact, and your defense ability will take effect. Also on the shortcut menu is your magic abilities, divided into 4 different categories. These are mostly self-explanatory. As stated earlier, I find magic attacks too expensive and ineffective to be a viable battle strategy. But you can raise your intelligence stat high enough to do some major damage at least for a hit or two through here. Magic attacks at the very least have much more range than your standard weapons, though they cannot target distant boxes you may want to destroy. Most of your magic will be spent on buffs like Prostasia and Heracles, both of which I recommend using at the start of every battle before launching your first attack. This is one RPG where buffs are a necessity. To get the most out of magic, make sure you have a weapon drawn while using it, as a weapon's intelligence modifier does not work while the weapon is sheathed. And always remember, this game is very serious and consistent with its rules. If you cast Magic Ward on yourself to make sure an enemy's magic attack doesn't hurt you, don't expect to be able to cast a healing spell on yourself right after. It'll break your Magic Ward and you won't receive any HP from doing it. And the last thing on this menu besides the item menu shortcut is break arts. Break arts are a bit special and, like offensive magic, are hard to find a general use for, but here's how they work. If you use a single weapon for long enough, such as an axe, a rapier, a polearm, or what have you, eventually you will discover a high-level technique with that weapon. These automatically unlock after prolonged use, and most weapons have at least 3 of them. These are very powerful attacks, but come at a cost of HP, so they're not to be used lightly. That said, despite them being powerful, the chance of them hitting is still tied to risk. And with good chain attacks, you can easily surpass the amount of damage a break art can do against most enemies. Break arts also cannot be chained. The two big pluses break arts have is that they break through enemy defenses a little better, and they do not add to the risk counter. The final phase of the final boss I completely beat with nothing but break arts and buffs. No joke. I couldn't do damage with chain attacks or any weapons I brought into battle, but I could get between 25 and 50 with my break art. So I cast Prostasia, Heracles, and Magic Ward on myself, then kept using break arts and items to restore my HP. The boss himself couldn't damage me, and I took him down in about 9 minutes. So if you make it to the end and need a strategy, there you go. Note that unlocking a break art with an axe will not carry over as a break art for a sword. Each weapon class's break arts must be unlocked separately. Now let's talk about these weapons, cause this is where it gets really ridiculous. We'll start with weapon and armor crafting. We're not going to spend too much time on this cause I don't fully understand it, and I don't think the designers fully understood it either. There doesn't always seem to be a lot of logic to it. There is a massive crafting chart if you want a recipe book of sorts, but for the most part, you're better off just messing around. First off, the assembly part of crafting can only be done in workshops. Different workshops are only equipped to handle specific materials, so if you have something you can't combine with something else, you may want to take it to a different workshop. Weapon disassembly, on the other hand, can be done anywhere. Weapons are disassembled to their core components so they can be reformed into something new. You can choose to combine weapons, armor, and blades, and actually look at what the outcome will be before you commit to it, so experimentation is definitely encouraged. Pay attention to the affinity charts on the side here and to the stats listed below to see if you can get something that's going to work for the enemies you're fighting. The affinities won't usually start very high, but we'll get to how to raise them in a bit. If you can't find something you're happy with the outcome of, I'd suggest combining a bunch of the same blades if you have 5 or so rapiers in your inventory. Combining identical blades raises the stats with each new one added. So yeah, can't really say much about this besides experiment. Build with a purpose in mind. Say you want a sword to kill dragons with, then try to build something with a higher dragon affinity. Don't commit to a build you're going to regret. You may want the materials for something else later. Now, this weapon crafting stuff won't mean as much if you don't understand weapon stats, so let's look at them. This is the real fun stuff. These stats down here are mostly self-explanatory. Range determines how far you can reach with your attack. Risk is the amount of risk used on standard melee attacks. Strength is your physical damage modifier and endurance. Intelligence is your magic modifier and resistance. And agility is your base accuracy and evasion. The stats listed under the ORG section are what the weapon does on its own, and the stats under the EQP are the total stats when accounting for all equipped gear. Up here we see DP and PP. No dirty jokes. DP is your weapon durability. When DP drops to 0, the weapon doesn't break, but its efficiency is horribly reduced to the point of being near useless. On the plus side, you can easily repair any weapon at a workshop, but it comes at a cost. When weapons are repaired, it drains the PP meter completely. PP, no dirty jokes, stands for Phantom Power. As you attack or guard with your shield, the PP meter goes up. The higher the PP meter, the more effective the attacks and defenses with weapons and shields are. In an ideal world, you'll want DP and PP to both be maxed. No dirty jokes. But such a balance is easier to dream about than to pull off. Earlier in this video I said if you were responsible, you don't have your weapon drawn at all times. This is because leaving weapons and shields drawn while not using them gradually drains PP over time, so only draw weapons when you need them. Now let's look under class. You'll see 6 categories here: human, beast, undead, phantom, dragon, and evil. The higher the number in the category, the more defense you have against creatures of that type, and the more damage you can do to them. If we look under the affinity category, we see a similar thing. Physical, air, fire, earth, water, light, and dark. The higher the number in each category, the higher your defense and attack property is for each. And last, under type, we have 3 choices: blunt, edged, and piercing. Just like before, these are your attack and defense values with and against weapons of that damage type. In Vagrant Story, it is imperative the enemies you attack are weak in all 3 categories your weapon is strong in. Enemies do not have large health pools, but their defense is very high, so if you come across a beast-type enemy who's weak to fire and weak to blunt weapons, you better make sure you attack him with a blunt weapon with high beast and fire stats. If not, you won't be getting very far very quickly. If your stats in those categories are low, there are quick and easy ways to raise them. Many shields and weapons have 1 to 3 slots for you to equip gems into. Gems turn the tide of battle and can almost completely and instantaneously rearrange your weapon's capabilities, so equip gems that will work in your favor. Another big help here is the item you have equipped in your accessory slot. You'll be swapping gems and accessories a lot in this game, so get used to it now. If you're having trouble discovering an enemy's weakness and you're far enough into the game, try using the Analyze spell or consult a guide. Otherwise, it's going to be a lot of trial and error. I don't typically suggest guides, but to cut down on the tedium and experience this game, you may want to consider it. Now let's say you don't have the gems needed or a weapon that's naturally strong enough on its own to kill the enemies you're fighting. Well, you can train a weapon to have better affinity. Here you can see I built a weapon I called Dr. Broad. This was meant to be my dragon broadsword, but when I started it, it was still very weak in the dragon category. Well, if you go out and kill loads of dragon enemies, that weapon will learn an affinity towards them. You can grind affinity in almost any category, and early on, if you're stuck, I'd even recommend you do it. Really, this is about all I can give you to go on early on. Hopefully it's enough that you can consult this and get through some tight spots. As a quick recap, here's your checklist. Learn enemy weaknesses. Build and equip the appropriate weapons. Equip the appropriate gems and accessories. Buffs like Heracles, Prostasia, and Magic Ward are your best friend. Debuffs like Silence, Lead Bones, Tarnish, and Degenerate are your second best friend. Use buffs at the start of every battle. Train weapons when needed. Keep risk low by using efficient moves to kill enemies fast. Keep DP and PP high if possible. Keep a healthy variety of weapons in your inventory that cater to different enemies. You never know when you might need them. And though I never mentioned it earlier, don't leave elixirs and wines in your inventory. Vagrant Story has no character leveling system, and these items permanently raise your character's base stats. Use that shit as soon as possible. Hopefully this video has been useful and you now find yourselves equipped for the treacherous and unforgiving land of Lea Monde. Though this game is very tough to learn due to its lack of tutorials, it's not nearly as complicated as it seems to be. As always, folks, thanks for watching. This video wouldn't be possible without the fine folks over on Patreon. If you want to see more videos like this, consider supporting the show for only $1 a month. You'll get early access and be able to control some of the content going forward. As always, folks, thanks for everything that you do.